Question: what would the founders think of current gun regulations?
Assault weapons bans, for example. 1994 federal ban, or state-level laws. Bans on semi-automatic rifles like the AR-15 would shock them. Not because of the regulation itself, but the firepower. Muskets fired one shot every 15 to 30 seconds. Modern militia arms are unrecognizable. Hamilton's Federalist No. 29 call for a well-regulated force might make him open to restricting weapons too destructive for civic order, especially if he saw them as beyond militia needs. Washington, a soldier, might agree, recalling his frustration with poorly equipped but chaotic militias. He'd want effective, not excessive, arms. Jefferson, though, might argue these are precisely the tools to deter tyranny, per his dangerous freedom stance, and resist any ban as a step toward disarmament.
People in militias back then used the same weapons as the military, so keeping with that context that the individual had the same weaponry as the military, would the AR-15 really matter? Today, the AR-15 is quite disadvantaged to modern weaponry. The founders may think the citizenry is at risk of tyranny.
You raise a sharp point. In the Founding Fathers era, the weapons individuals and militias carried, muskets, flintlock pistols, and early rifles, were indeed on par with what the military used. There was no significant gap between civilian and military firepower, which aligned with their vision of an armed citizenry capable of matching a standing army if tyranny arose. Applying that context to today, where the AR-15 is a common civilian rifle, but vastly outclassed by the military's advanced weaponry, for example, fully automatic M4S, drones, tanks, missiles, the founders might see a troubling imbalance. Let's explore how they'd react to the AR-15 in this light. The AR-15, a semi-automatic rifle, fires 1 round per trigger pull, with a standard magazine of 20 to 30 rounds. It's versatile and widely owned, but compared to military gear, like the M4 carbine, fully automatic, 900 rounds per minute, or crew-served weapons, it's a lightweight. In 1787, a militia member's musket was functionally equivalent to a British soldier's Brown Bess. Both sides had the same tech ceiling. Today, the disparity is stark. Civilians can't legally own machine guns, post-1986 ones, per the Firearms Owners Protection Act, let alone artillery or air support. The founders might see this as a betrayal of their intent. James Madison, in Federalist No. 46, argued that an armed populace gave Americans a decided superiority over a federal army, estimating a militia of near 500,000 citizens with arms in their hands could resist tyranny. If he saw today's gap, AR-15s versus Apache helicopters, he'd likely warn that the citizenry's ability to check a tyrannical government is compromised. He might not care about the AR-15 itself, it's just a tool. But he'd question why civilians are stuck with inferior arms while the military's firepower has leaped ahead. He could argue that banning or restricting the AR-15, while leaving the military unchecked, tilts the scales further toward oppression. Thomas Jefferson, with his dangerous freedom mindset, would probably take it harder. In his 1787 letter to William Stephen Smith, he wrote, "What signify a few lives lost in a century or two? The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." He'd see the AR-15 as a bare minimum, maybe even insufficient, given the military's arsenal. If anything, he might push for civilians to have access to more advanced weapons, arguing that parity with the state is the whole point of the Second Amendment. An AR-15 ban might strike him as absurd when the real issue is the government's overwhelming edge. Alexander Hamilton, ever the pragmatist, might have a nuanced take. In Federalist No. 29, he envisioned a militia that's well-regulated and effective, not necessarily matching the army gun for gun. He'd recognize that modern warfare, drones, cyber weapons, makes muskets-to-muskets parity impossible. He might not mind the AR-15 itself, it's useful for militia drills, but he'd likely say regulating it is beside the point when civilians can't counter tanks anyway. He could argue for some restrictions on civilian arms for public safety, but he'd also warn that a disarmed populace loses its deterrent power entirely. George Washington, the soldier, knew firsthand how critical militia firepower was against the British. During the Revolution, he relied on civilians bringing their own guns, often as good as or better than military issue. Seeing the AR-15 dwarfed by today's military tech, he might echo Madison. The citizenry's at risk of being defenseless. In his 1790 militia plan, he wanted citizens armed with standardized, military-grade muskets, Extrapolating, he might say the AR-15 is fine, maybe even too weak, and push back against bans, fearing a helpless populace. So, would the AR-15 matter to them? Not as a specific weapon. They'd be agnostic about its design, but as a symbol of civilian capability. They'd likely see its regulation as a distraction from the bigger issue, the military-civilian firepower gap. They might argue, it's too little, not too much. The AR-15 doesn't give citizens the parity they had in 1787, so restricting it weakens an already underpowered populace. Tyranny risk spikes. If the government can outgun citizens this badly, the Second Amendment's check and balance role collapses. Madison's and Jefferson's nightmare. Context shift. They'd marvel that we're debating a rifle when the military has missiles, suggesting the real question is whether civilians need more to match the founders' intent. They'd probably conclude that modern regs miss the forest for the trees. Banning an AR-15 might not faze them if citizens could still access equivalent military small arms. But since they can't, they'd see it as piling on an already lopsided disadvantage. Jefferson might even quip, "You're pruning a twig while the state grows a cannon."